Good evening, friends. Welcome back to Below the Bible Belt, Part 2, Judah or Israel, a kingdom born divided. Thank you for joining us wherever you are in the world, in different time zones. It's nice to see familiar faces and some new friends joining us. I'm in Jerusalem, and so we're going to ground ourselves in just a moment with a breath and a prayer and an intention. And also just housekeeping that if there is a siren, there have been here quite a few, um, I will have to interrupt this flow and go into a safe room and might lose Wi-Fi. So fingers crossed, it's a quiet evening in Jerusalem. More about that later. Wherever you are in the world, friend, thank you for prioritizing a Sunday slot for our journey, our year-long journey, exploring the ancient schism between the kingdom of Israel and the kingdom of Judah, and what does it mean for us today, personally, collectively, whether we are Jewish, not human. There is much to learn from this history, and I'm excited to be here with you today. So I invite you to get organized. A couple people might still be joining us, but take a moment to turn off what you don't need right now, screen, a window, close a door. Find a way to ground yourselves in this hour of learning we will have together with 30 minutes afterwards to have some questions. I invite you to sit up if you can, feel your body, honor your breath, maybe close your eyes for a few seconds and ask yourself, what am I doing here? What is it that I'm looking forward to? What is my intention? How do I show up for this Zoom circle? Find your breath. Hmm. Shoulder roll, whatever we need to really be here now. Good. So I recognize many of you, and I know we've been on these journeys together through the Bible Belt Round One, and through Lab Shul events, and through other learnings. Some of you are joining for the first time. That's great. If you can open your camera and be with us with full presence, that's even better. We're a small community of learners. And if you can't for any reason, we understand. The amazing Taylor Ackerman is with us as our Zoom moderator. Thank you, Taylor. And I will also say, and I will announce it later as well, that some of you may have seen in my email to the Lab Shul email following this session. It's going to be at 9:30 p.m. my time, I guess, 3:30 p.m. Eastern time. I will stay on. We're going to move to another Zoom room for conversation about what is going on with this Fakakta war. I've been here since the beginning. There's a lot to share. There's a lot to tell. There's a lot to ask. It's a conversation. So if you want to be part of that, we'll have a couple of minutes to stretch and be that as well. We also have a dear friend today, my teacher and co-learner and colleague, Dan Liebenson, who's uh, who's here. Hey, Dan, who's going to share some words at some point about one of the readings for today and the book that I recommended to you all via Substack last week, The Secret Book of Kings. More about that in a moment. So I think that's our general housekeeping. I'm going to ask you to keep questions maybe in the chat or to yourselves, and I'll take a couple moments here and there. But mostly we're going to take the 30 minutes at the end to really explore questions. So what is this all about? Why are we here? For some of you, this might be a reminder. Some of you, this might be the first time thinking about it. This course, Judaism Born Divided, follows on my hour, 3.5 years of reading through the Hebrew Bible with the big question of what is the Bible comprised of? There are two national ethnic ideological narratives, the one of the kingdom of the north, the kingdom of Israel, and the kingdom of the south, the kingdom of Judah. Lesser known as far as the rift, lesser known as the differences. There's a lot there that speaks to this moment right now, where different ideologies are determining the outcome of Jewish life and political life in Israel, and now the Middle East and the world, while we are at war, which might escalate to a much horrifyingly larger scale. So that's the whole journey of this year. Israel, Judah, what is it about? What do we do with it? More about that in a moment. This third session, after we've had some background and some build up, and you can obviously watch the videos of the previous two sessions and read the study sheets, and we'll share the third one in a moment. Today is the last Passover. It's a political parable about the limits of liberation and about what the history of Passover, the Jewish holiday that's coming up in just 11 days, has to do with how this rift erupted and what are the stories of these different holidays teaching us about the story, the evolution of the rift between Israel and Judah, the creation of sacred time, how calendar is a political creation, and what questions are we bringing to this Passover Seder, which is full of yearning for liberation, peace, and justice, and understanding that we've been here before and it's complicated. So hopefully we'll hit all those markers and questions. I'll do my best. This is the third of 12 monthly sessions, and hopefully by the end of the year we have a better sense of what this story is about. I'm learning it along with you. So we're going to go into source number one in our sheets, and Taylor is going to be sharing it, already has the link in the Zoom chat. And source number one is really about the political. It's a article that was published in September 2023, 6 months after Israel has erupted into protests over the judicial reform that have begun really pinning different ideologies in Israel in a much bigger way, and alongside that, camps in the Jewish world and beyond. This is before October 7th. And what we know is that the last 2+ horrific years have taken what's in this article, what was the tension between different tribal voices in the Israeli Jewish conversation, to a whole new scale of horror and concern. But the seeds of what we're seeing here and how it's connected to the biblical can be found in different thoughts that have arisen during these many, many years. So I want to share with you this piece of an article from Eliezer Chayon, a sociologist, a Jewish thinker, who wrote in Israel Hayom, a pretty kind of right-wingy Israeli paper, which interestingly really published this whole long piece. He's talking about the judicial reform that Netanyahu's government is trying to create, very much like in the United States, the notion of a judicial system politicized. And he writes, the judicial system that is increasingly polarizing the people of Israel into two separate camps has given rise to civic initiatives calling for a separation between Israel and Judah, right? Already referencing those ancient biblical kingdoms. In contrast to the latter, Judah, which would be conservative, religious, and include Jerusalem as well as the West Bank, Israel proposes the establishment of a liberal Israel that would encompass Tel Aviv and the coastal plain cities. But it's not just about geography. These calls back then and now are maybe not mainstream, but they are consistent and their reference is clear. The biblical separation between the kingdoms of Israel and Judah, which lasted for centuries and was interrupted only by the exile of Israel and then by Judah. It seems that those indulging this idea, which appeared risky to some and compellingly realistic to others, have not really examined the original event, those two kingdoms that once existed in the land of Israel. In their glory days, they extended as far as the Euphrates River, today's Iraq, from the river to the sea, and in less fortunate times are washed with blood, loss, and exile. Are they indeed relevant to us? Who cares about the ancient Judah or Israel? The answer might be both frightening and hopeful. The root of today's crisis seemingly does not stem only from the implementation or lack of a judicial reform, but rather is the fruit of a long standing anger, humiliation, fear, hatred, and vengeance between the two tribes of Israel. So, this is just to give us the context. And this is also when my suspicion began to be aroused. And when I started looking at politics and thinking, how did we get here? How did we get to this polarization we can today identify as Zionist or diasporist, as right wing or left wing, as America first or Jewish first, or as universal versus particular? While this does apply universally and globally and might also be relevant to what's happening within Christianity and within Islam and certainly within the world, I'm really going to focus on the Jewish story, not so much the Israeli story, because I think it is most relevant. I invite us in our own thinking and in questions later to expand this notion beyond. And one more thing I will say, this is not just about politics. This is not just about history or ideology. The notion of Israel versus Judah, particular versus universal, Jewish in one way or the other, is also very much about the human experience. We each have a Judah or Israel within, a voice within ourselves that likes the particular, that wants the familiar, that wants to be with my people on my land, my God, my language, at the expense of the pluralistic we. We're all grappling with these voices. So while I'm dealing here with both a biblical, ideological, political, and historical invitation to learn more about how we got here, there's also an element here of deeply personal reflection on our being. And if we get more into Passover, we will see how that is part of that as well. The Passover is also, on the one hand, a narrative and a holiday about Jewish history and the evolution from a place of crisis and slavery into opportunity and liberation, but it's also a personal story. How at every generation and every year, we get to ask ourselves the question, how am I free? How am I not? How am I part of the problem? How am I part of the solution? What does liberation look like for me this year? How can I be helpful? So there are many layers here. We're not going to touch it all, but I invite you to open the windows in which these different layers might arise. Okay? So that was our overture, the political, historical, personal, the ideological, all that in the middle of a time of crisis, right? In the middle of a war. Some of us might be feeling it more than others. But these questions are not sitting in a vacuum. They're real. I'm hoping they'll be helpful to help us make sense, make some order, and grow. Let's go back in time. I'm inviting us to go back in time and at least to source 2 on your source sheets on page number 2. So you see on the very top, and Taylor, maybe you want to share the study sheet so we can, on the screen, easier for folks. You will see the diagram on the very top, which is the first 5 kings of the kingdom of Israel and the kingdom of Judah. Yes, we are in patriarchy. There were queens. They mattered. We're going to focus on the kings for now. The first one was Saul from the tribe of Benjamin in the north, the first official king of Israel. We're going to come to him and his progeny and issues in a bit. Saul was replaced by David from the tribe of Judah in the south. David, complicated character, was the father of many princes. One of them was Solomon, and he became the next king. As soon as Solomon died, in other words, just 2 generations into the Davidic empire, the empire crumbles and splits into south and north, Judah and Israel. Rehoboam, one of the sons of Solomon, becomes the king of the south, the king of the very small kingdom of Judah, and Jeroboam, who we're going to meet today, more detail, becomes the king of the north, the kingdom of Israel, the much bigger king. The first quote from source number two, just to give us some context, is from Shmayahu Talmon, an important historian and scholar of this period. And he's really helping us focus on the notion of the calendar. Right? One of the ways culture is determined is time, is calendar. Right? Passover is in 2 weeks, the full moon of the month of Nisan, all over the world. Basically, all Jews celebrate Passover on that day. If you are in the diaspora, you might be celebrating 2 days. Here in Israel, it's one day, but it's all around the full moon. Easter, on the other hand, is celebrated on different moments on the Christian calendar, whether you are a Protestant, Catholic, Greek Orthodox, etc. Ramadan, consistent, etc., etc. How calendar is constructed is not exactly rocket science. It sometimes is, but it has to do with the political ideology and formation of identity. So let's look at what Talmon is telling us about the beginning of the calendar tension and the story between the South and the North, which has to do with two different calendars. Jeroboam, as I said, was the first king of Israel. Specifically, and we're going to get to that in just a moment from the book, the secret book of Kings, Jeroboam, who started off as the tax collector for King Solomon, becomes the king of Israel and starts a dynasty. We're talking about roughly 922 BCE, right? So we're sort of in this time of still the shift into Iron Age, and he ruled for 22 years. So most calculations are that he became king at 922 BCE until 901 BCE, maybe a little later. And he, in the famously in the biblical depiction in the Book of Kings, one of his first big actions as a seceding from the kingdom of Judah was to create a new calendar. One of Jeroboam's first acts, I'm reading Talmud right now, one of Jeroboam's first acts of sovereignty, following closely upon his open revolt against Rehoboam and his election as king over the northern tribes, was the break with Jerusalem and the reestablishment of Shechem, modern-day Nablus, as the capital of the new kingdom. This stroke shattered the centralized administration of public affairs carefully built up by Solomon. But Jeroboam knew that further steps were required to cement the recently won independence. In order to estrange the Ephraimites, that's the northerns, the tribe of Ephraim, from Jerusalem, which later was bound up with the dynasty of David, a break with Solomon's temple was imperative. The custom of sacrificing in Jerusalem had to be abolished. Above all, there had to be found a means of cutting off the northern tribes from the contact with Judah and its capital, which manifested itself again and again in the time-honored institution of ascent to the temple. So let me explain. Taylor, you can unshare for just a moment. Sometimes we think that things have been around forever, but they haven't. Solomon, David, we're talking about less than a century. Solomon builds the temple in Jerusalem, and one of his main acts is centralizing worship in Jerusalem. Think about the entire region of the land of Israel, 12 tribes, some kind of a confederacy. Almost every tribe had its own temple. Every tribe, every geography had its own sacred space, had its own customs, own maybe unique holidays, different languages. The Zebulons in the north or the Menashes in the south west, the Judeans or the Simeons had different synagogues, different temples, different churches, different bowling alleys. People had their own particular ways of being. They were not exactly the same. Maybe their names of their gods were a little different. You can think of the indigenous tribes of First Nations in the United States, in Turtle Island, as an example of that, or your own life, right? As we're not exactly the same thing, even though we might have some consistency. Solomon created a centralized reality. Jerusalem now included a temple that was built with a lot of taxes and a lot of slave labor from the 12 tribes. And the temple had to be the only place where people come to worship Yahweh. The other temples were eventually outlawed with great violence and with resistance from the other tribes who liked their local convenient temple. The Solomonic insistence on a single temple is a religious statement, a political statement, a financial statement. All the taxes come to Jerusalem. The priestly dynasty and hierarchy is connected to the palace. It's all centralized. Centralized versus decentralized is one of the tensions between Judah and Israel, or if you'd like, between Israel and the diaspora. Is it the center, or are there many centers? Jeroboam says no more going to Jerusalem, people. You don't have to go on pilgrimage to Jerusalem anymore. It's been a generation or two. We're changing the rules. We're going to set up temples and shrines just like our ancestors did back in the land of the north. You can go local. By doing so, he's severing the ties that were constructed by Solomon, to an extent by David, and creating sacred spaces as opposed to sacred space. He's giving autonomy for a lot of different territories, and with that, indigenous religiosity. Space is one way to create difference. Then there's the creation of sacred time. And that's where we're entering this notion of Passover and the different holidays. What Jeroboam does, and we're going to read the text in just a moment, he creates a holiday which is either a new holiday or a recreation of an old timing of a holiday. But either way, something dramatic happens as soon as this split between South and North happens. Taylor, if you would share the screen again, we're going to look at source number 3 and actually open the good old Bible, which the more I read and the more we read together, we know, who wrote this? What is their agenda? One of the ways I want to invite you to join me on this journey is to keep asking ourselves, who wrote this text? What is their agenda? What are their agendas? What are the secret codes of, bootleg scribes that have put other messaging in there? We'll get there in a moment. So here we are, shortly after the split. Jeroboam is declared king of the north of Israel. Rehoboam is king of the south. And Jeroboam established a festival on the 15th day of the 8th month in imitation or in connection to the festival in Judah. He established one at Bethel, that's in the north, and he ascended the altar there on the 5th day of the 8th month, the month in which he had contrived of his own mind to establish a festival for the Israelites. Jeroboam ascended the altar that he had made in Bethel. Okay, so some of you are very Jewishly experienced and literate, and some of you are maybe new to the story. The 15th day of the 8th month is 1 month after the holiday of Sukkot. In the ancient Jewish and the modern Jewish calendar, we have 3 major pilgrimages: Sukkot, the holiday of harvest in the fall; Passover, the holiday of the wheat harvest and liberation in the spring; and Shavuot, Pentecost, the holiday of different harvest, and later on Revelation towards the summer. Those were 3 pilgrimages to the temple where people actually went on pilgrimage and came to the temple and bought their gifts and paid their taxes and moved the economy and met together. Sukkot, the holiday of fall harvest, is on the 15th full moon of the 7th month of Tishrei, right? Nowadays it falls just after Yom Kippur. The 7th month is the month of the high holy days. So why is Jeroboam doing it on the 8th month? Right? There was already a 7th month, according to the book of Kings, that happens in the 7th month, as it does now. Why are we moving from the 7th to the 8th? He's creating a new calendar. He's changing the date of one of the 3 pilgrimages, and that's going to, like a domino effect, going to change everything. So here I am going to just give you a hint. We're going to go straight into the 4th source in just a moment. But if you're confused a little bit, just try and imagine what it would be like if Thanksgiving was pushed to December 25th, right? That will mess with Christmas, maybe with Hanukkah, but it's like, what are you talking about? It's always the third week of November. What happens if you're going to change the calendar? I'm not even talking about other religious holidays, but what do you do if two different groups in the United States are celebrating Thanksgiving on two different dates? What is that going to do to families, to narratives, to shopping, right? To travel? A major shift is happening here. So I want to show you the next source, and then we're going to start to make sense. Why is Jeroboam doing this? And what is the secret here? So let's start with this very short quote from a book written in Hebrew, and Dan is going to tell us a little more about it in a moment. I gave you translation credit. I know it's a little ambitious, Dan, but you get some credit here. This is a very short quote from the book. We're going to read it, and I'll tell you a little bit about it. Mother took me to the leper's cave for the first time on the, you recognize the date? 15th day of the 8th month. Ooh, that is the northern holiday of the harvest. Then Israel, Sukkot, not the Judean one. I remember the date because of the festival of rain, which turned me into the most famous boy of Zeredah. That's the town where Jeroboam, first king of Israel, was born in. And that's him talking in first person. The story spread quickly throughout the entire land over time. Everybody wanted to hear about the little boy who had managed to fool the king's soldiers and save his townspeople. Hmm. I'm giving you this tidbit just to entice you to read the book. We're gonna hear more about the book in a moment. Um, so what is it about this eighth month and the 15th day? Why did the holiday change? Who is this boy? What's this festival of rain? We're gonna read one more text from Dahlia Marks, and then Dan, I'm curious what you share with us about the background and the story of this book. So source number 5 is from Dahlia Marks, who's a dear friend, a teacher, a rabbi, an author, and a scholar. And she writes the following about this holiday, which will lead us into the Passover. Jeroboam's revolt against the kingdom of Judah was political, social, and even religious. And unlike other biblical rebellions, such as that of David against Saul, it was nonviolent. Jeroboam was a charismatic leader who refused to submit to the cruel tax system imposed by Solomon and his son and heir, Rehoboam. His revolt erupted only after Rehoboam had threatened the already overtaxed people with further impositions. And we saw that at last month's session, right? My father made your yoke heavy, but I will add to your yoke. My father chastised you with whips, I will chastise you with scorpions. That was the march of folly, as we saw the quote, and why the system broke. The Bible describes the festival that Jeroboam instituted, or to use its term, devised of its own heart, as a negative initiative. Right after they broke, he moves the holiday a month later. But if we examine this new festival carefully, we find that it not necessarily be regarded as an act of idol worship. The festival was observed exactly 1 month after Sukkot, which falls on the 15th day of the 7th month. Or as the book of Kings says, and as we just read, Jeroboam ordained a feast in the 8th month on the 15th day. The biblical narrator emphasized that this was like the feast that is in Judah. Accordingly, Jeroboam did not create a new festival, but rather institute a type of leap year, as it were, thereby placing Sukkot in the following month as a type of second Sukkot, just as the 14th of Iyar, the month after Passover, was determined in the Torah as a second Passover for those who had been unable to observe the original festival due to ritual impurity. We'll get to that in a moment. Accordingly, while this indeed constitutes a new occasion not mentioned in the Torah, it is grounded in the biblical calendar, and its method of innovation is not without a basis. Some commentators have suggested that Jeroboam reinstated an ancient northern harvest festival celebrated a month later than the occasion marked further south in Judah. The colder climate of the north meant that crops ripened later, thus justifying the setting of a later date for the harvest festival. Be that as it may, and Taylor, if you can roll us further, thank you. Jeroboam's act was crucially important. Those who control the calendar control the guiding mechanism of the life of the people. By creating an autonomous calendar for the north, Jeroboam ensured that from this point forward, the calendar of Israel, and thus the daily life of her people, would be separate from those of Judah. It's possible that pushing Sukkot 1 month later reinstated the earlier tribal tradition that had to do with the weather. If it's colder in the north, which it is, the crops are ripe earlier, and the northern harvest is a different moment than the southern harvest. One size fit all is one size fit none. Or Jeroboam is just saying, sorry guys, we're creating a new calendar. We are cutting off from the mainstream. We're creating our own mainstream. Jeroboam's protest was manifested not only in the dimension of time, a new calendar, but also in the place he chose for his festival. By creating an alternative central for worship, he achieved his political goals to avoid the need for residents of the north to conduct the pilgrimage to Jerusalem and to undermine the centralized religion and hence economic force of the city. Jeroboam's act symbolized a return to the ancient revelation and the primordial foundation of the people while circumventing the Judean religious authority in Jerusalem. Different space, different time, two different kingdoms are born. Now we get to Brandis's book. In her historical novel Kings 3, or as it is known, The Secret Book of Kings, Yochi Brandis, a very well-known and prolific Israeli author, depicts Jeroboam as an enlightened leader with an unusual monotheistic and pluralistic vision. She portrays him making a coronation speech in which he calls to the assembled masses. My brothers, my beloved, my people, I hereby announce the resumption of the ancient festivals of all the tribes of Israel. God loves all our festivals. The rain festival of Ephraim, the fire festival of Menashe, the dairy festival of Benjamin. And God loves the harvest festival of Judah too, just as he loves the festivals of the other tribes. No less, but also no more. We will all continue to celebrate the festival of liberty, the wheat harvest festival, that's Passover, and Sukkot, the three central festivals of the people of Israel. But each tribe will celebrate the other festivals separately, as our ancestors did before us. The separate festivals do not harm the unity of the people. I direct my call from the top of Mount Gerizim to the mountains of Judah. My brothers, my beloved people of Judah, do not split yourself off from us. Return to us. Let us all be one people and one kingdom, as God promised to our ancestors. Brandis's interpretation has been the subject of sharp criticism, and it is certainly true that it is incompatible with the usual reading of the biblical text. But to those willing to take a fresh look at the story, this subversive reading and its model of ritual pluralism in ancient Israel are not unreasonable. Any religious behavior and any religious text or ceremony always has political and social dimensions. So this is Rabbi Dalia Marx's text. And Taylor, we can unshare for a moment. And I want to invite Dan to take a couple of minutes and share with us your thoughts on being part of this book, why you wanted to be part of it. Why do you think it's an important text that Yochi created? And I mean, I'd love to have much more time with you to get the juice and the dirt on the backstory. But as I've been rereading this book again in English, I read it first in Hebrew, I'm so struck by how important it is to this moment right now. And so I'm curious to hear whatever thoughts you have to share with us. Then we'll take a couple of questions. Welcome, Dan. Thanks for being with us.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me here. I mean, I'll just start by saying that the reason why it's called the Secret Book of Kings in English, but Dahlia Marks talks about it as Kings 3. In Hebrew, it's called Melachim Gimel, like the third book of Kings. But we were worried that English readers would say, I didn't read the first two, and they would think it's a sequel. So we called it the Secret Book of Kings. So the story really is that this is about 15 years ago, I think. I was it was in the days, and Amichai, you were very much part of this, where there was this like innovation ecosystem going on in the Jewish world, and there was this kind of excitement that there was all this innovation happening, but it was kind of underfunded and undervalued in a lot of ways. And because one of my theories was that it was undervalued because it seemed like something new and just modern. And I wanted to make the claim that no, it was tied to um, various elements of Jewish history, among which was the Northern Kingdom. I thought of the Northern Kingdom as this more, I mean, all scholars think of it as this more pluralistic kingdom, more plugged into the kingdoms around it, whereas the Southern Kingdom, Judah, was a hilltop kingdom, and many hilltop peoples are kind of more cut off from the world and tend to become more religiously extreme. And so the Northern Kingdom, the one that was more plugged into Mesopotamia and the world around it, you know, I imagined that maybe it was more creative and innovative, and that if we could attach the story of innovation today to an ancient story, that it would have more of a sense of authenticity and power. And so I said to my sister who lives in Israel, I really wish that there was a novel about the Northern Kingdom and how it was really pluralistic so that we would have something to attach this movement to. And she said, "Oh, actually, there is this novel. It just came out in Hebrew. It's not exactly what you're talking about, but it's elements of it." And that was when I read that book in Hebrew and then approached Yochi and said, is anybody trying to translate this into English? And she kind of said, "Oh, knock yourself out. People have tried and not succeeded." But fortunately, I stumbled into some connections that helped me do it. Michael, I think you're on mute.
Yeah, no, I'm muted. Do you think Yochi had like the same political aspirations as you to present a historical narrative of a pluralistic Judaism versus a more particular Judaism as a role model or as a roadmap for where we are now? Clearly, she wrote this before we were at such deep odds with each other. But as somebody, Yochi Brandis, I will just say, grew up as the daughter of a very important ultra Orthodox rabbi. Right? She's the daughter, the renegade daughter of like Hasidic dynasty, and she went way out. And so she's dealing with patriarchal Judaism in her own way. And as I'm reading it again, I'm like, whoa, she's got beef. She's really imagining the kingdom, the northern kingdom, Jeroboam and the house of Saul as everything that the house of David and the Netanyahus and the kind of Judaism, supremacist Judaism that we want to like have nothing to do with. She's got a political agenda. I'm asking. I'm
Yeah.
assuming.
Yeah, I very much so. I mean, I think that the way that this wasn't really the novel as much the novel that I wished had been written and was looking for is that this novel I think is more anti-David than pro-North. The pro-North is implicit and it's certainly part of it, but a lot of it is really just talking about how David was bad um and the story of David, which we've inherited to be one of our great hero, actually, if you read it more closely, and the thing I love most about Yochi's writing is there's nothing in the book that's not supported by text somewhere. Like she's not just making things up, she's finding things in the text that once you look it up, you're like, oh my God, I never read that before. But it actually is there. And so
Right.
there is all this material in the stories that suggests that David wasn't so great and there was I think it's important to understand that a lot of scholars think of the Bible as having been written largely after the destruction of the Northern Kingdom. So in the years after 722 BCE, so in the 700s, 600s, and um, and they're living in the South because they're refugees from the destruction of the North, but a lot of the writers are actually Northerners, or they're descended from Northerners, and so they kind of have split um, loyalties, and in some ways they know they have to write it to accord with the mythology of the South because that's where they live, and the North doesn't really exist anymore. But they can kind of sneak their perspectives in as well, and so you get a mixture. And so I think Yochi is really interested in sort of teasing out those strands that are in the text that suggest that there were critics of this sort of fundamentalistic and nationalistic version of Judaism and Jewish
Yeah,
polity as is true today.
yeah. Thank you. Dan, I got a million more questions about Kings 3, the Secret Book of Kings. I'm like almost done reading it again. Reading it in the middle of this journey is astonishing. So many things I missed the first time. And I will also say, and I'll talk about that later, reading it in the middle of this war that we're in, and I'm here in Israel, and propaganda in media, and like, this is the official story. You're like, oh my God, there is a counterculture, there's a counter narrative. And this book highlights the hidden, um, subversive narratives that point at something much more expansive and better, kinder, pluralistic, inclusive, hopeful than either or propaganda. Thank you, Dan. I'm excited to continue this journey with you. I know you're big on the Israel, Judah, North South narrative, and I'm so excited to hear, and I'm honored. We'll continue. Um,
Great.
and stick around later. I'm sure people will have more questions. So thank you. And I want
Of
us
course.
to evolve through our journey. Harriet, I saw your question, and we'll come back to it. And I think it will also make sense as we talk about it more. I'm going to move us into the next source from what Bundes is writing about and Dahlia Marx is talking about, what Dan was talking about, that at some point these kingdoms split, the particular versus universal, the grand north with its cosmopolitan outlook, think New York City, versus the much more small and particular, I don't have a good US version, it's not exactly DC, but the closed and conservative versus the more expansive and liberal. And the calendar has a lot to do with it. Jeroboam creates an old new calendar, creates new temples, and everything shifts. The North and the South are going to spend hundreds of years in either active or slightly passive civil war. And sometimes they're going to fight with each other. Sometimes it's going to be very different. They're sort of worshiping the same God, Yahweh. They're not. Yahweh has different depictions in the north and south. They're sort of on the same calendar. They're sort of in the same language, but they're also not. And again, think south north, not exactly the U.S. now, but whether you're watching Fox or watching, MSNBC, you are and you're not living in the same country. That's sort of the equivalent of what I'm seeing, obviously the same now. So I want to look at the next source because now we're getting to Passover, right? We're going to look at two Passovers. And first, I want you to look at this chart in front of us that we keep coming back to. Now, this chart is the history of the royal houses of Israel. We're not going to look at all of it. You already saw the one on the top, Saul, David, and Solomon, the split to Judah and Israel. And I'm going to ask you to zoom all the way down on the left to the king called Hezekiah. So it's 1, 2, 3, 4. Oh, thank you. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. He's the 13th king in a row from the loins of David. And he's a really important king, King Chizkiyahu. What can we say about him? He actually is famous for a bunch of architectural and urban constructions, including the tunnel of Hezekiah that you can still walk today. He is, like I said, the 13th king in line, while the north had many dynasties. They kept rebelling and changing. The south was consistent with just the house of David. Hezekiah is born roughly in 740 BCE, and he rules for quite a long time. He's the son of Achaz, and who was a king who went super pagan in Assyrian style. And Hezekiah is one of the first to create a religious reform in which it has to be much more like the old days. It has to be the God of Israel. There are no idols. There's much more insistence on a rigid religiosity. And importantly for us, Hezekiah is the first king of Judah who is facing the destruction of the north. The Assyrian Empire takes over. The kingdom of Israel is very strong, very rich. It is destroyed by the Assyrians for its wealth and also to not be a powerful force in its way. And so in the year 722 BC, Samaria, the northern capital, is leveled. The last king of Israel is killed. Many of the Israelites, the people of Israel, are exiled. Many of them, as Dan said, move to the south and bring the northern Israel traditions with them to the south. Hezekiah creates a centralized religion. Once again, one temple, no other temples, only Judah, no Israel, one God, no goddesses, one law, not different traditions. He's very insistent. And one of his main actions is to create Passover as a tribal holiday for all the tribes. He creates something very dramatic. And so let's look at the next source, which is from the book of Chronicles, which gives us another version of what happens during those days, very much from a pro Judah point of view. One more thing that I want to say is that Passover probably existed in some way. There wasn't a Passover Haggadah, no Manischewitz, none of the Manishtanas, many of the things we know today, but it was a holiday in which lambs were sacrificed, maybe wheat was celebrated, fresh wheat. There was or there wasn't a story about the Exodus. We're not sure. The Exodus is really a northern narrative, not a southern narrative. We're going to talk about that at our next session. But Hezekiah is creating the Passover that will become the model of Passovers for years to come. We're going to rather quickly read through these verses in the book of Chronicles. Hezekiah sent word to all of Israel and Judah. Right? This is after the destruction of Israel. He also wrote letters to Ephraim and Manasseh, the big tribes, to come to the house of God in Jerusalem to keep the Passover for the eternal God of Israel. Right? This is after hundreds of years in which they didn't celebrate in Jerusalem. They celebrated in the north. But there is no more temple in the north. The king and his officers in the congregation in Jerusalem had agreed to keep the Passover in the second month. For at that time they were unable to keep it, for not enough priests had sanctified themselves, nor had the people assembled in Jerusalem. The king and the whole congregation thought it proper to issue a decree and proclaim throughout all Israel, from Beersheba, way in the south, to Dan in the north, that they come and keep the Passover for the eternal God of Israel in Jerusalem. Not often did they act in accord with what was written in the original book of Torah. So the courtiers went out with the letters from the king, and his officers through all Israel and Judah, by order of the king, proclaimed, O you Israelites, people of the north, return to the eternal God of your fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, and God will return to the remnants of you who escaped from the hand of the kings of Assyria. Do not be like your ancestors and kindred who trespassed against the eternal God of their ancestors and were turned into a horror, as you see. Now do not be stiff-necked like your ancestors, meaning the people who worshipped in the north on their own calendar and in their own temples. Come back home. Submit yourselves to God, to Yahweh, and come to the sanctuary that has been consecrated forever, and serve the eternal your God, whose anger may hopefully turn back from you. If you return to God, your brothers and children will be regarded with compassion by their captors, the Assyrians, and will return to this land. The eternal, your God, being gracious and merciful, will not turn away from you if you return. So what's happening here? Hezekiah, after the destruction of the north, is sending messages to the north, people who are traumatized by exile, and says, look, you no longer have a temple in Samaria. Passover is coming. Come worship it in Jerusalem. Forget the split. Bygones are bygones. If you don't come to us in Jerusalem, you'll be spread out. But if you're with us, we'll be one. It's important to note that at the beginning of this text, Hezekiah is postponing Passover by 1 month, from the full moon of Nisan, which is in 2 weeks, to the full moon of Iyar, the following month. It's a prescription that is allowed in the Torah because of ritual purity. People have to be in ritual purity to do Passover. And for some reason, they are not because of death or whatever. You can do Passover a month later. He pushes Passover a month later. Bear in mind that Jeroboam, the first king, pushes Sukkot a month later, creates another calendar. Why is Hezekiah, hundreds of years later, pushing Passover a month later? Is it because of impurity? Or is he trying to match the calendar of the north and entice the people of the north to be on the same page with the south? We're not sure. But look at what happens. Messages are sent out to the north. Come worship with us in the south, in Jerusalem. As the courtiers pass from town to town in the land of Ephraim and Manasseh in the north, till they reach Zebulun, all the way north, they were laughed at and mocked. The northerners were like, are you kidding? We're not going to go to Jerusalem. Screw you. Some of the people of Asher and Manasseh and Zebulun, however, were contrite, and they did come to Jerusalem. The hand of God was on Judah too, making them of a single mind to carry out the command of the king and officers concerning the ordinance of God. A great crowd assembled at Jerusalem to keep the feast of unleavened bread in the second month, a very great congregation. They set to and removed the altars that were in Jerusalem for the pagan gods. And they removed all the incense stands and threw them into Nachal in Wadi Kidron. They took all the ancient idolatry that Hezekiah's father, King Ahaz, introduced into the temple, threw it all iconoclastic style into the river. They slaughtered the Passover sacrifice on the 14th of the second month. The priests and Levites were ashamed, and they sanctified themselves and brought offerings to the house of God because they re-sanctified the temple and they didn't have enough manpower to have proper consecration. That's why the shame. They took their stations as was their rule according to the teaching of Moses, agent of God. The priests dashed the blood that they received from the Levites. Since many in the congregation had not sanctified themselves, the Levites were in charge of the slaughtering the Passover sacrifice for everyone who was not pure, so as to consecrate them to God. For most of the people, many from the north, Ephraim and Manasseh, Issachar and Zebulun, had not purified themselves. They had not been part of this religious system for a while. Yet they ate the Passover sacrifice in violation of what was written. Hezekiah the king prayed for them, saying, the good God will provide atonement to all who set their mind on worshiping God, the eternal God of their ancestors, even if they're not purified for the sanctuary. God heard Hezekiah and healed the people. All the congregation of Judah and the priests and the Levites and all the congregation came from Israel, it's two different nations, and the resident aliens who came from the land of Israel who lived in Judah, in other words, these are people who are not Jewish, who are part of the congregations, nevertheless, rejoiced. There was great rejoicing in Jerusalem, for since the time of King Solomon, son of David of Israel, nothing like it had happened in Jerusalem. Wow. So this is the Passover of King Hezekiah, the first official Passover to be celebrated, bringing the people of the north to the south, creating the centralized image. They're eating the Passover, they're eating some kind of bread. Whatever is happening there with the healing, we're going to not talk about, but the Bible is telling us this was the greatest celebration. Nothing like this has happened since the United Kingdom before the split. This is Hezekiah's Passover. Super important, but we have one more Passover to look at. We're going to run a couple of minutes later from the hour, my apology, because I do want us to make sure that we look at the next Passover. I'm not going to read this text here from this scholarship that explains why it's such a big deal that this Passover of King Hezekiah sets the tone for the other Passovers. It has to do with when the Book of Chronicles was written and what reality it's dealing with. Because just like Brandes is creating a modern telling of politics based on the Northern Kingdom, whoever wrote Chronicles after the destruction of both North and South wants us to tell a story about reunification, even if that was not the real thing. And why those different months have to tell us about different calendars, and really the attempt to create an anti-split, to create a unity where the reality is that we're not united. We are on different pages, different calendars, and different temples. I'm going to invite you at your own pace to look at source number 8, which I wrote. It is part of the Bible Belt that I wrote about this chapter in the Book of Chronicles, why Hezekiah made this daring move of moving the holiday to the south and moving it to the calendar of the north. But I wanted to move forward to the last Passover of Jerusalem. Fast forward from Hezekiah. There's no more kingdom of the north. He's creating a kingdom. There's a kingdom of the south that imbues the people of the north. And after Hezekiah, there's a couple more kings who are also kind of not observing the Jewish laws as rigidly. And by the time the next king comes around, King Josiah, the most important religious reform happens. And the Bible, as we know it, begins to be written under Josiah, who is the next and almost last king of Jerusalem on our list. Hezekiah was the 13th. Josiah is the 16th. He's his great grandson. And he lives between 640 and 609 BCE. He's one of the most important kings who really develops Yahwehism as we know, Judaism as we know it. And he absolutely creates another Passover. So look at source number 9. King Josiah, who found a book of the scroll of the Torah in the temple as they reconstructed it, and demands that all the other pagan ways, the ways of the north, are exorcised, and priests are killed, the priestesses are killed, sacred trees are cut down. They're creating a new religion based on the old, and Passover is really important to them. The king commanded all the people offer the Passover sacrifice to the eternal your God, as prescribed in this scroll of the covenant. We talked about the scroll last time. It was the one that Huldah the prophetess agreed was important. She was the last prophet of Jerusalem. This is the last Passover. Now the Passover sacrifice had not been offered in that manner in the days of the chieftains who ruled Israel, or during the days of the kings of Israel and the kings of Judah. In other words, according to this account, Passover has been dormant. Only in the 18th year of King Josiah was such a Passover sacrifice offered in the manner to God in Jerusalem. Josiah also did away with the necromancers and the mediums, the oracle idols and the fetishes, all the detestable things that were to be seen in the land of Judah and Jerusalem. Thus he fulfilled the terms of the teaching recorded in the scroll that the priest has found, and this is the new religion as we have it. Passover becomes the holiday that for King Josiah unifies the new form of Judaism, Judah style, Judaism from Judah. The Israel ways, the more expansive ways, the different spiritual ways, the non-centralized ways are banished. So Passover becomes this political telling of an important reign, an important switch. We're going to look at one more text here, which is source number 10. If you look at what we're seeing here, and I apologize if some of this feels too fast and we're not getting some of the subtleties of this historical shift. I just want to explain something, and Finkelstein, who's source number 10, is going to help us make sense of it. explains the history. The reign of King Josiah of Judah marks the climax of Israel's monarchic history, or at least it must have appeared that way at the time. Josiah was the Messiah of sorts. His messianic role arose from theology of a new religious movement that dramatically changed what it meant to be an Israelite or a Jew and laid the foundation for future Judaism and for Christianity. That movement ultimately produced the core documents of the Bible, chief among them the Book of Law, discovered during the renovation by Josiah in the Jerusalem temple in 62 BCE, the 18th year of Josiah's reign, when this Passover is. That book, identified by most scholars as an original form of the Book of Deuteronomy, sparked a revolution in ritual and a complete reformulation of Israelite identity. It contained the central features of biblical monotheism, the exclusive worship of one God in one place. Remember, centralized. National observance of the main festivals of the Jewish year, Passover, Tabernacles, in a single place, single calendar, and a range of legislation dealing with social welfare, justice, and personal morality. This was the formative moment in the crystallization of the biblical tradition as we now know. Embellishing and elaborating the stories contained in the first four books of the Torah, they wove together religious variations of the stories of the patriarchs, placing the adventures of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in a world strangely reminiscent of the 7th century BCE and emphasizing the dominance of Judah over all Israel. I'm not sure why it's hard to hear. Hopefully you can hear me now. Just one second. Let me just switch something here.
Okay. Hopefully it's good again. Apologies. So what Finkelstein is telling us basically is that Josiah's Passover is reimagining Judaism. And from that moment onwards, Passover Bible becomes a single narrative. And the northern narratives are woven into it, mostly forgotten. The calendar becomes the southern narrative. And what we're seeing in these stories of Hezekiah's Passover and Josiah's narrative is basically the creation of the calendar, the creation of a consistent theology, monotheism, history, and the supremacy of the Davidic Judean holiday. That's the Passover we got today, but it didn't start that way. We're seeing strands and layers of history woven in. And part of what we're doing here in this course is listening to these older layers, the other festivals we had, the other ways of being Judean or Israelite before we became so-called one. I'm going to end with a very short quote from Marcia Falk's Book of Beginnings, which is a invitation to rethink Passover. And I want to invite this as an invitation for you all to think about what you will bring to your Passover this coming year. She writes the following: loss, suffering, hopelessness, broken spirit, broken self. Our lives are broken off by death. The human condition is brokenness. But there's also another kind of breaking, the breaking open of the heart that puts us in touch with our deeper selves, and that may even serve as a gateway to wholeness. What is the wholeness of self? Does it depend on outer connections, bonds between self and other, between self and world? Is it the feeling that one is part of a greater whole? Or is it an inner connectedness, an awareness, a knowingness sustained from within, a bringing forth to consciousness the hidden parts of the self? And might this deepened consciousness offer a path to freedom? Or is wholeness all these things and perhaps more? We dwell in a world of brokenness, but we yearn and strive for wholeness. It is elusive, but it is our birthright. The pursuit of wholeness is the human calling. She's talking about Passover, about the broken matzah, about the move from slavery to freedom, from contraction to expansion, from the past to the future. She's also talking about Judah and Israel. She's talking about what it's like to have been born split, but desiring wholeness. She's talking about right now, what it's like to live in a moment of political polarization and divides, and yet hoping on some way to find common ground, to find unity not by coercion, but by celebration, by recognizing the differences, the dignity of difference, and yet finding common ground. So, Passover this year, despite political divides and whatever we are holding painfully during this war and so much suffering in the world, in the US, in Israel, in Iran, in Lebanon, in the West Bank, and beyond, I hope we find some way to sit around the same table and find narratives that unite us, despite the ones that divide us. That, my friends, is the last Passover. We are ending on a high note into Passover. This is the third of our sessions on the Judah-Israel story. When we meet next time, we're going to look more into the history of the concept of Israel and what is it about the different narratives of the South and the North, whether it's Abraham or Moses, whether it's Jacob or Joshua, that became one single narrative. We have many more sessions ahead of us, and I rely on your questions and inquiries and your feedback to fine tune and tweak as we move forward. So this speaks to all of you and is informative, both to understand where we come from, how we got to this messy reality, and what we can do to forge a better path. I want to take a breath here and pause. For those of you in the room with me, thank you. For those of you watching us later, I hope this tour de force is full of breath and focus, that the text sheets are there to help you take it slower and read it and pause as you go. And I'm going to invite us for the next 15 minutes to share some questions. All right? And then we're going to, in 20 minutes, for those of you who want, we'll shift gears and be in another Zoom room to talk about current events. But let's stay in this Judah versus Israel, last Passover, and the meaning of this Passover for right now. If you have a question or a thought that you'd like to share, questions, have a question mark at the end. Thoughts, but shorter is better, so more of us can share them. Let's do it. And if you didn't have a chance to ask your question, please don't hesitate to write to me, and we will continue this conversation in other ways.